Joining me on the podcast today is Sarah Kay, Global Client Leader at architecture and design firm Woods Bagot. Architects, everybody loves them. They have an amazing influence over the look and feel and culture of our cities. But how does the business of architecture work? And in a world where cities are still recovering from a global pandemic, what role does design and architecture play in helping our cities adapt? Well, Sarah Kay joins me now to delve into these questions. Welcome to Smarter Cities.
Thank you very much for having me. Absolutely no way I can answer all of those questions.
Well, look, it's an interesting time, I think, to have you on the show, and great to have you here. I think there's been so much debate, even in the last couple of weeks, around what the purpose of a city is. And, do we need to come back to work? And what are office buildings for? And, there's one school of thought that says, hey, we need great global cities as we've always experienced them, and another that says, well, maybe we don't need them and they need to change. And I just thought, who better to ask than an architect on these questions?
Perfect.
Right. So before we get into it, I generally like to ask how you got into things that people do. So you've had a fascinating background. We've got to know each other recently. You're at a big global firm. You lead this firm. And what I've always found interesting about architecture practices and studios and is how people who are sort of so creative end up sort of running big global businesses. So what was your journey to that?
Well, I think my favorite story to describe my sort of career is my registration exam for becoming a registered architect in Australia. And the examiner asked me that exact same question. How did you become an architect? When did you know you wanted to become an architect, Sarah? And I said, well, my grades weren't good enough for law school. And he laughed and said, hilarious joke. That's obviously a joke. It was the truth. I was weighing up between architecture and law school all the way through, and definitely had an interest in law and that side of business, I think. So I think that sort of shows that I did have a reasonably business-focused side to my creative endeavours.
So you always had a bit of the bent, is what
I think so, yeah. And probably it's more of the sort of creative strategy and communication skill set rather than necessarily the sort of, I call them pencil creative versus talking creative.
Yeah.
But yeah, and I think my career over the years, I started off in Melbourne and then I got moved to our London studio quite early, and so then that sort of pushed me into a business building role pretty early on in my career, and so that's really where I've come from.
And what did your principals kind of identify you as somebody who had the bent to be a business builder?
I think so, yes. I think I think there's a bit of a gender bias sometimes in those decisions within architectural firms as well. I think females are often pushed into that sort of business building management side of things earlier in their careers, which is potentially another line of conversation.
I was expecting you to say the opposite. I was expecting you to say that common to most organizations that, historically there has been a challenge with getting more women into management generally, right? But you've just told me the opposite.
Yeah.
So why do you think that is?
So architectural firms are different than any other business in terms of, because we have, are they different? This is what we should talk about. That sort of design leader, the person who holds the pencil and holds the creation of the idea, is definitely the sort of highest esteemed person within the organisation. They're the linchpin, they're the people who really do make a difference in terms of brand and design outcome and quality. But there's a lot of stuff that go around that person in terms of management, leadership of people, financial management, clients, business development, those sorts of things. And those roles tend to prioritise women to take them, whereas the design principal role, I think, historically has had a bias towards males.
Fascinating.
Zaha Hadid is the only one you can name.
Yeah, I suppose that's right. Coming from a infrastructure background where I came from, I must admit I didn't spend a tremendous amount of time with sort of design and architects because I was looking more at the deal structure and the finance and how you make this sort of things happen. But obviously now working in property and infrastructure, design plays so much more of an important role. I think the architect part of it has always been interesting to me because that's where the vision begins, right? If you have an idea and you kind of want to make, I call it the hero shot, or what is that image that captures an imagination that then allows you to create something, right?
Image or very strong narrative.
Or narrative.
Which is sometimes, I think, deeper, just that really strong idea that is always, everything's pulled along by that idea.
But see, that's interesting because I've often felt that. I'm more of a words person than I am a image person in a world of PowerPoint, which is interesting. But I find now increasingly in a social media world that content seems to be more well received if it's imagery, if it's video, if it's picture.
Yeah.
Now this concept of the grammable moment, like which somebody said to me, and if you want a reflection on your age, when someone says to you that's older than you, hey, you've got to be more grammable.
You say, what does that mean?
What does that actually mean? And why do I need to be more grammable? Right,
It means that you need more Photoshop.
Yeah, exactly.
But
well, thank you for that. I'll take that under advisement, please.
No, I think the narrative can be communicated visually, so I don't think it needs to be. But we're lucky in Australia, the way that we communicate our design quality, the rigor in our design is through a narrative, a strong idea that pulls it along. In other parts of our business, it is definitely an image flashed in front of somebody for sort of 5 minutes and they choose their favourite one of 5 images. I don't think that gets the best outcomes for cities or for design outcomes. I think really having a strong idea that's contributing something back to the community, I think. This is so off track from where we're going, but I have 3 questions that I ask people when we're sort of designing it. How does this add value to my client's business? How does this make the people who are using that building's lives better, richer? What's the experience of users? And how is it saving the world? And if you can answer each of those 3 things, the third one might be just a little bit saving the world, but moving towards.
So it doesn't have to save the entire world.
It doesn't have to save the entire world. It has to contribute to saving the world. And so if you can answer those 3 things in your design narrative, that's a really strong design outcome, not just a grammable image.
Yeah, no, from that perspective, I totally agree, right? I think the hero shot has to be backed up by some form of evidence, right? So, for example, some of the concepts we're looking at together, like what would the cultural use of the White Bay Power Station be, right? A beautiful heritage asset for Sydney, for New South Wales, for Australia, that will be preserved for all time because it's been said so by the government.
Yeah.
There's an opportunity there to create something really special for Sydney, right? That is an arts and culture hub, which as a city, if we're going to be a global city, we need to do more of. And Michael Castle, who's one of Australia's great producers, who was on this podcast not too long ago, before you and I started this conversation, and now we're on this journey around what it was, and you've done some work on what that hero shot is. And if you think about that started with the narrative, didn't it? Like, why do we need this in Sydney?
Yeah.
I use the line, what gets us on the bottom of London, Paris, Tokyo, New York, Sydney? How does Sydney get on that list of top global cities? And there's a bunch of ways that we can do that, right? One is, we attract the best talent, we create new industry, we do all these things. But I've increasingly over the last few years realized the role of arts and culture and creativity to the actual health of a city.
But the plans for White Bay do both of those things that you spoke about. They absolutely do attract the best talent, and they absolutely do create experience that makes Sydney, world class. And it is really interesting. The part of that work was sort of mapping the broader infrastructure of the industry that would come with
Correct.
a theatre. And you know, it just keeps going forever when you start to really look at what would be stuck on to that amazing theatre experience. And so the creation of those arts jobs and the ability to actually really make financially viable, you know, great business around the arts is really exciting as well. And I'm sure that you're not drawing the same parallels that I am between the power station and the Western Sydney Airport. I was out there yesterday, so it's really front of mind.
Fresh in mind. Yeah. I'm out there next week.
And just the amount of jobs, the amount of new industry, the amount of opportunities that piece of infrastructure opens up to Western Sydney is just so rewarding. That's why we do what we do, because all of a sudden you're changing people's lives because of a piece of investment in infrastructure. And the power station is the same.
Is the same. And you know, the fascinating thing about the White Bay Power Station and the opportunity for an arts and culture hub there is Michael, like you, very creative person. I asked him similar questions. How did you end up running a production company? And his answer was, well, I wasn't good enough to be an actor.
He was an actor,
so,
yeah.
so I would
failed lawyer, failed actor.
Right, so we always start somewhere. And but interestingly, you realise, as you hear him speak, that arts and acting and theatre is the same. Like, we only ever get to see the elite, but what's the pathway to get there? There is, you know, you start in community theatre, you go from community theatre to, you know, your sort of first grade, to use a sports analogy, and then you hit the Premier League. You have to have an ecosystem, and if you don't have a place in a city that allows that ecosystem, you know, Dieter Colvin, who works with Michael, talks about the costume designers and the wig makers and the, you know, all you know, the people who make set design, all of those jobs, makeup artists, it goes on, and in this city compared to Melbourne or other cities around the world or West End or anything like that, that ecosystem isn't quite right. And so you know, I think the beauty of working with an architect like you and your team and Lend-Lease as a development group who thinks about cities in these ways, and a producer like Michael, is as a group we can come together and help government and the public sector to achieve some of the outcomes that come out in the you know, whatever it is, the arts and culture strategy or the infrastructure strategy or the you know, future transport strategy that was released recently. And so that's why I get excited about projects like this. And it's always a challenging process to seed an idea. Just to bring it back to where we got to on narrative, and it's always a challenge to get the narrative right, because the forces of no in the world, whether it be a public sector department or a community that's concerned, or you know, or a bunch of residents who might be concerned, or whatever it might be, or an overly aggressive media that tends to knock any idea on the head before it's even a thing because it sells newspapers. I'm going on a slight rant here. Is difficult. That is a difficult world that we live in now, to actually seed new ideas. Without narrative and without imagery and without effort and without passion, you don't get a coalition together to make things happen. So, and architects for me play that amazing role in helping to craft narrative,
sell that vision,
and sell that vision,
and I think that is a little bit around sort of that beautiful marriage between creation within an architectural practice and business savvy, because you really do need to know how to pitch it, how to communicate that to a client or to government, how to get the right people in the room, what is the strategy around making sure that that idea comes to fruition. So I think that is a really important balance between creativity and business acumen in terms of the way that architects work.
That's a good segue actually into our next thing I wanted to talk to you a bit about, which is the business itself, because So everybody wants to be architects, right? And it's interesting.
So surprised that you say
You,
that.
I listened
Do
to you
they
say to
really?
me, and you didn't feel that, and I
Nice
thought that
to
was
hear.
fascinating. In fact, as an aside, I even have my own version of architect outfits now because I was so tired in turning up to studios in a blue suit and a white shirt.
Yes, which
that
the
it was,
Lend-Lease
which
uniform.
is the
yeah.
Lend-Lease, and anyone
Yeah.
who works in development, really, or anyone who works in the city. You know, at least we don't wear ties that often
That's
anymore.
true.
Although I was
That's
wearing
one of
last
the
night.
good outcomes of COVID.
It's a good outcome.
Yeah.
The bankers got there far before us, but certainly the public sector hasn't quite got there yet. But so you know, everyone looks at an architect and thinks it's creative. It's these people are really cool, and you know, I looked at a pitch that one of our pitches for Circular Quay Wharves the other day, and the architect and the placemaking people, and they were all there, and they were talking about country, and it's like, wow, this is an amazing thing. The vision is amazing. But what goes into running an architectural practice, having been someone who argues with you on price and things like that, must be a massive challenge. So how does it work? How does an architect practice work? How does a global architect practice
Well,
work?
I think that's probably the first thing to kind of get clear is that scale has a really big part in this conversation, and majority of architectural firms across the world, but in Australia as well, are less than 20 people. So how do you run an architectural practice with 20 people? You be a great architect. The business side of it is not as important so long as the quality of your product and you've got somebody making sure that you do get paid is there. When you get to a global business with more than 1,000 people within it, it is actually a complex business to run, and it's more than just a group of projects stuck together. There's more complex things that go on. But I think the skill sets involved in running a project and running an architectural business are probably pretty similar in terms of, you know, there has to be an element of creativity, there has to be an element of foresight and strategy and people management, being able to inspire and organise and clearly communicate to people what you need them to be doing next. And then also, obviously, sort of vision, making sure that you have a vision for that business moving forward. So I think that architects have great skill sets that they learn at architecture to be able to run a business. But it shifts from, and not always, but often, it shifts from an architect who is leading the business and the design with people supporting them to multi-authorship, a group of people across an organisation of 1,000 people who all have something to contribute to the creative outcome. And so really it becomes a choreographer of all of those ideas and those people, somebody who can pull them together and really keep them moving in a direction that is a key skill set within a larger architectural organisation.
I think it strikes me, though, in a large organisation, and it's the same here, is maintaining creativity in the midst of bureaucracy. So my experience in civil service and here is that bureaucracy kills creativity, right? So the larger you get, the more systems and processes you get, the more human resources stuff that happens. You get mired in the running of an organisation to the point where there isn't a lot of capacity to think creatively. Is that an argument you agree with or disagree with?
No, I think that making sure that there is the support and the foundation to enable the creativity is the most important thing. I actually think we're probably overstating the role of creativity in even a project.
Interesting.
You know, the most important thing for you as a client and for me running a business is that it's technically very, very perfect. You know, so
this is true.
Making sure that the buildings work is our absolute and total, cannot fail. So the creativity is definitely a part of that process, but having systems and processes and QA systems and ISOs and all of those sorts of things to ensure technical excellence is fundamental. And so that's
I would add at a commercially sensible cost, right? So I think one of the jokes in the development industry is where you allow the architects to design the building and no one costs it, and the next thing you know the building is 3 times the cost of what it should have been.
I'm blaming that on inflation and price escalation.
That's right. Not an architect. I would say that's because the design people fell in love with the design before they did the work to understand what their budget was.
Yeah.
To then allow that building to happen. And there've been plenty of government projects in particular that have fallen down that trap. And the reason for that is because the design narrative starts first. No one costs a building. Some QS comes along and says this is your public sector comparator, not based on anything whatsoever. And then next thing you know, the market prices it, and it's not what this particular QS did.
And why does the government put budgets out so early? I never understand why a project's budgeted so early I mean,
so
I do, but why is it publicly known?
There is a reason for that, and it's silly. It's because historically, particularly in infrastructure, there were very large cost blowouts, right? And traditionally there were envelopes that were set, and they would breach even the envelopes. And so the reaction of most of the public sector was to add significant contingency, 60, 70, 80% contingency, which in a technical sense makes sense because you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
So you got to have contingency on the budget so you can kind of manage what it would be like. But the executive kind of went, well, if you have that much contingency on projects, instead of progressing 10 projects, I can only progress 3. So I'm going to give you a budget of X, right? And you need to go and meet that budget, which sounds reasonable enough. Except what has happened over time is that the budget just gets breached anyway, regardless of it. There is a variation claim, blah, blah. It gets kind of addressed. And so you're still in this cost blowout world.
And the architect gets blamed.
Architect gets, the developer gets blamed, the constructor gets blamed, the lawyers get blamed, we all get blamed. Right? So you're not alone, I assure you.
Government's one thing, but I think all clients
on the commercial side, I'm very happy to blame architects
more for their money than they get. So
that was a joke, by the way. I'm not blaming architects for anything.
But I think it is very, very common for us to get a brief that would like gold-plated taps and a budget that would like taps from Bunnings, and so actually making sure that we do get those two things aligned before we start designing.
Get some pretty good quality taps at Bunnings.
Probably gold-plated ones.
Probably gold-plated ones too. But I think there was always going to be that tension between design excellence and commercial reality, right?
And it comes back to my third question. Can you save the world a little bit? If you spend a bit more money, you might save the world a little bit more. And as an industry or a profession, there is a very large expectation on architects to come up with more sustainable solutions and to really innovate in terms of sustainable building practices. And so, we do push the bounds in terms of budgets, I think, when it comes to innovating in those sorts of areas.
But there's also an element of pushing the boundaries so the market catches up, right? So one of the arguments that Lend-Lease has always had has been on, for example, sustainability. This company was a leader on sustainability. We got out there well before anyone else, saying, we've got to get to carbon neutral buildings. This is the 6th year or something of Barangaroo being a carbon neutral precinct. But if you speak to our investment management colleagues, investors were happy to invest in our buildings because they were great buildings, but they weren't necessarily paying anything extra for the sustainability thing. It was an expectation. Well, you build the best buildings, so of course you should have this, right? Yeah. But there was not a relationship between the provision of that sustainable outcome and additional yield. Fast forward to now in a net zero environment where significant public policy push on this issue, corporations have adopted climate targets. I mean, this company is a net zero by 2025, absolute zero by 2040, which is the technological challenge that's been set by our board and our CEO. And now you're finding investors are willing to start to pay premiums for these things because their investors and their shareholders or their sovereign managers have said you have to. So in a way, that early push has now benefited now from that, right?
Yeah.
But having said that, other organisations have caught up. So what's the next You know.
And I think I feel like I'm always asking for more time and more money, but but I think as an industry, and I think this is sort of starting to happen, we might need to slow things down slightly in order to find that next innovation and really kind of, push ahead. Because the issue for us in property development is we don't test what's new until it's finished building 5 years later and then been lived in for 2 years. So you don't really know, and I often get asked, well, okay, that's really innovative. Show me where it's been done before. So, well, if it had been done before, it would have been done 5 years ago, and it would have been done everywhere, and it will no longer be innovative. So it is very difficult to innovate in the property industry because of the length of our projects and the cost of our projects.
No, we have a real focus on timber here, right? And we've decided that we're going to build a timber building in every big precinct that we do. So you've got 2 here at Barangaroo. For example, beautiful buildings. One's a WeWork, the other one's an Accenture.
Do they lease more easily or more difficult?
Well, at the time they were in high demand.
Yeah.
High demand because they were so unique, and people liked the workspace, and there was sort of research coming out that was saying being in a timber building is actually better. It's sort of better, like it's a better environment. It feels better. It feels more natural. We had investors saying, why don't we start a timber fund for timber buildings? But where that technology really came from in buildings was the building of a timber building in Melbourne some 12 years ago, 13 years ago. Forte, which is a residential building, is still there.
And not from overseas?
And overseas as well, right? But from a Lend-Lease point of view, the people, some of whom are still here, who were driving that thinking was a long time ago, right?
Yeah.
So I'm agreeing with your point, really, that innovation takes time, and we're trying to think about how you innovate with technology and digital, and what do we do in terms of insights into buildings. We have this product property insights that's looking at how buildings perform,
and historically Australia has actually been one of the most easy to innovate in markets / cultures of all of our studios around the world.
Really, I would have thought you would have said New Zealand.
Maybe, but not as many opportunities as often.
Okay.
New Zealand does tend to follow Australia, but compared to New York, absolutely not. Do it the same way that you've always done it. San Francisco, really not. Surprisingly,
yeah, really hard.
not.
Really hard.
LA maybe a little bit. UK, absolutely not. Europe, absolutely not. China, not really. Maybe, but they're probably not quite as rigorous in terms of sort of how they're innovating. But Australia has been seen, particularly in commercial real estate, by most of our clients around the world to be somewhere to come and see the next best thing.
That's fantastic.
But let's not lose it, I think is the point I'm making. I think we're maybe not quite as brave as we used to be.
So what's the risk? What's changed? Why are we not as brave?
Yeah, I don't know. And no, I think it's financial pressure. I think just the financial pressure is sort of
always
come
blame
on
the blue
a little
suits,
bit
is that what it is?
more, and people are just a little bit more scared when things are getting tighter.
But some of that, I mean, I get that, but in an environment now where you've had a global pandemic, you've got rising interest rates, inflation concerns, global markets are sort of under pressure. You've still got many empty buildings around,
and a lot under construction.
A lot under construction, and in fact, it's a good segue into this. Yeah, it's not surprising there's a bit of financial pressure. So one school of thought, I guess, is that innovation just sort of gets priced out. But surely another school of thought would be, well, now is the time to think about how we do things better. So one of the areas I wanted to ask around was, what's the role of architects in that and designers in that? So if it's true, as we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, that the city, the concept of the city is under pressure from this work from home sort of era. And Bernard Salt now talks about, because he presented at one of our conferences, the city being a place where you come in for training and people and culture experiences and an event, but you kind of go home, and your home is now the place where you work, and that's why it's become adorned with, you know, all the latest gadgets, and your home office is set up properly. And
I feel
whatever.
like Bernard Salt's always worked that way, and this isn't.
He's always worked that way. That's correct. I suspect so. But I thought to myself, my goodness, if the only reason why we're working in the office is for training purposes and the occasional lunch, wow, that's a fundamental shift. And he may not quite have gone this far, but for the purposes of being provocative, I'm going to say he has.
Yeah.
Is that true? What do we think?
I am blissfully naive and optimistic when it comes to the impact of COVID on our cities, in that there won't be one. I think it's slowed down growth in terms of large corporate occupiers not needing to expand as quickly as they otherwise would have. But I feel like we'll get back to a normal where people crave feeling part of something bigger and part of something more than their home and corner coffee shop. But that's probably just me projecting me onto everybody else. I think there will always be this sort of option for hybrid, but there will always be a requirement for our cities, and people will always want an experience better than the experience that they have at home.
Yes.
So do you want to watch the new Top Gun movie on Netflix in your lounge room, or do you want to go and see it on the big screen? So that experience that's better than, do you want to work in your little cold office at the front of the house, or do you want to come in and be part of the whole sort of cultural experience of work? And sometimes you stay at home and watch it on Netflix, but sometimes you're going to want that big experience as well. And our cities will have the best experience in terms of food and beverage, the best experience in terms of live performance or movie performance, or so the best will be in the city, and that will attract people into the city.
Goes back to our conversation on White Bay, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like how do we get on the map?
And White Bay also is, that will never be replaced. That experience of a live performance will never be AI'd out of existence.
No.
I probably will be, but that won't be. And so that is our future. That is what the city has to be focused on.
And again, it's also about accessibility of content, I think. I totally agree with your view on this. Because, with theatre, for example, there's different types of theatre, right? So there's different types of product, sport, ballet, opera, whatever. All of those have a home in the city. I don't think you can locate that in a suburb and create, that kind of density and, networking effects or agglomeration effect that comes with a city that Ed Glazer always talks about. I don't think you can recreate that in the suburbs in the same way.
I think it's more around the diversity of those things being proximate. And I'm thinking of Sydney Olympic Park, where there's no diversity.
Why hasn't it worked,
to it?
Right?
And it is just one of those things that is the attractor. And so you do need to actually create sort of dense and diverse nodes. Parramatta, Sydney CBD, maybe we're looking at sort of others more broadly. And I've got a sort of real focus on Western Sydney around actually creating that same accessibility for all of those different art forms and entertainment and quality in the West as well as in the East.
I think the politicians for both persuasions feel the same way. It's important. They call it the webbing. We've got the spine right now. We've got the airport. We've got rail links going in, major roads, right? But we've also had substantial housing development, including by Lend-Lease. A lot of master plan communities, some mid-density stuff. But we haven't quite got there on social infrastructure yet.
Yeah.
And particularly not in aligning the delivery of the social infrastructure, whether it be schools and hospitals, which is where everyone goes to first, but arts and culture.
Yeah.
And we're building the Powerhouse Museum, for example. That's something we're very proud of. It's a very complicated project, but look at the pain that public officials had to go to make that decision to get it there.
Yeah. Well, you did have to move a heritage thing and put it in the cupboard, but we won't hold that against you.
Sure. But do you know what I mean? Like the announcement of a arts and culture precinct in Western Sydney.
And the Allianz Stadium, you know,
Allianz
how
Stadium.
hard was that to get rebuilt?
You know,
Which is, it's interesting.
anyone
People
who
don't
had
see it
seen
as
that
a priority.
stadium and had been to Queensland Stadium and, you know, or Suncorp or any of the others, and went to the SFS, would say a global city needs a new stadium.
Yeah.
Like a new, you know,
Yeah.
if we're going to do this, we need this.
And it's a question of priorities.
Yeah.
But I think the risk, and this is sort of back to the post-COVID city and how do we make the most of it and the role that architects play. Obviously, sort of planning policy and architects having a role in sort of the urban and master plan outcomes of these new or existing precincts. But making sure that the investment, huge investment in infrastructure that the government's made is optimised by the right mix and density of uses around each of those investment nodes. And I think at the moment we run the risk of being a little diluted in terms of where those nodes are really getting densified, probably only because of a little bit of a slowdown in terms of population growth through immigration and COVID slowdown. So we do need to focus on kind of.
Well, I think that's coming back, right? The government has now lifted the cap, which I think is very, very welcome. You know, this country needs people, and it needs people to help it grow. I think one thing I'm really happy about in most jurisdictions, Melbourne, Brisbane, Sydney, the massive investment into rail links started as trains first, because that was what we needed, and now everyone really has accepted the notion that actually rail nodes are critical. So you look at Martin Place Station, that's transforming Martin Place. The way they're talking about Sydney Metro West, whether it be Parramatta, which is a game changer for Parramatta.
Yeah.
You know, you look here at Hunter Street, will be a game changer for that part of the city. The recognition around place is now really important.
Yeah.
And by place, what we're talking about is not just, you know, access and egress from the station. It's when you get there, why are you there? What's the purpose of being there? Are you there to do something? Right? We're at Victoria Cross, again, North Sydney, a new heartbeat for Victoria Cross. And other cities do this, right? You see it in Singapore, you see it in Hong Kong, you see it in London. You know, Queen Elizabeth Station's just opened. I mean, like that's the pathway.
And I think it's reasonably simple to get right in the existing centres where we've got new train stations in emerging markets. I think we've got a really, really important part role to play there that goes to density first. So you create walkable places in these new transport locations rather than deserted train stations where everyone gets into their cars and drives away. And that's a little bit of a change in Australians'
100%
great Australian
100%.
dream in terms of how they live.
I always think about the South West Rail Link when it was built. It was built, you know, it was great, rail link, whatever, but it had a car park, and at one point there was no road underneath it, so you couldn't get from one side of the station to the other.
Yeah, right.
Because at that time, transport thinking hadn't really integrated enough.
So
right?
Definitely not a connector.
Not a connector, right? Now, of course, they've fixed all of that, but you know, I think there's a lot more thinking around this, and you know, I think all of us in the industry have done a lot more looking overseas. I mean, there are very few global companies in Australia that look at these things. You know, architects do it. Certainly, development companies, you know, aren't that many of them. And overseas experience is so critical to sort of doing things better, because we are, you know, I've always been a passionate advocate of the fact that we are in a global competition for talent, we're in a global competition for capital, but we're also in a global competition for ideas, and we shouldn't assume that we are the only ones with good ideas. We should go and steal as many good ideas as possible and bring them back.
And we should import those people with good ideas.
We should import them back.
But it is, I mean, my absolute drive for density at nodes comes from 3 years of living in New York. Like, it was just the most incredible neighborhood and community, and just my kids grew up with people everywhere that were their friends, you know, on their street. Complete mix, walking everywhere, safe everywhere because of the amount of people that were on the streets. And so the sort of quarter-acre section with 3 cars in the garage and the big fences that come down as soon as you've parked feels so foreign to me now. But if you haven't lived overseas and experienced that, it's hard to understand the benefits of density.
I think that's right. And again, we are a large country with a small population.
Yeah.
So, I think back to a former premier that talked about Sydney being full. I think our population at that time was under 5 million. We're heading towards 7.
Yeah.
Right, in this city.
Yeah.
Right. I wonder whether he's reconsidered that view. But at that time, that was what he said. Hey guys, how are we going for time? We're going okay. Will you wave at me when we've hit the hour? That'd be great. Thank you. So that's actually a great segue as well. Back to architect world. What's the craziest story you've got for me, being an architect? What's the craziest project you've worked on?
Well,
you've done this globally, right? So
yeah,
there must be something crazy.
I mean, front of mind at the moment, not the craziest, but one that I probably should mention is obviously Western Sydney Airport. And I think the craziness around that is just how we are awarded projects and how we mobilise for them. So I think it's important that people know how this works.
We did the groundwork on that deal. Yeah.
Right, okay. So you spend a year or more bidding for a project. You start to get an idea that you might be close to winning it. Start to get an idea. So for that period of time before you're kind of awarded, you're thinking about how you might mobilise, but you can't start paying people because you don't really know that you've been awarded. So then you win, and you start the next day. So you have to find a team of 40 or 50 people very, very quickly. So that idea of mobilising for a major project, I think, is the most hectic and most difficult.
And do you draw them from all of your practices, or are they?
Yeah,
so you draw them from globally.
So that is the beauty of Woods Bagot, that we were able to mobilise in Melbourne, in Brisbane, in Adelaide, and in Sydney at the same time. So then you're actually not trying to find 40 people in one market. You're building from existing and from others. But I think probably my most glamorous, crazy project in my life was our Google Tokyo project.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Google Tokyo.
Google Tokyo. So no studio in Tokyo. We won the project on the back of projects for Google all around the world. Yeah. And so all of a sudden had to send people to live in Tokyo, which is actually quite difficult to do.
Yeah, it is.
Had to register a business there, which again is quite difficult to do. Lots of flying in and out. I was living in New York at the time, so sort of flying, full time zone and 13 hours every couple of weeks into Tokyo. But we delivered that project from a couple of people on the ground in Tokyo, Beijing, Hong Kong, Sydney, Singapore, New York. All had team members working on that project for the majority of it. So it was a truly sort of global studio contribution, and it was equally weird because Google in Tokyo is like a little world into its own. So I was going into Tokyo, which was very foreign, and then Google in Tokyo, which was even more bizarre.
And were they mostly local Japanese recruits?
No,
they were
so
overseas recruits.
Probably 50-50, but it did
really?
feel like, am I in San Francisco or am I in Tokyo? I had to remind myself every day.
That's fascinating. I mean, the whole Japanese market, I just love it. It's just a wonderful country.
And again, I think the reason I found that project so rewarding was because it did answer my 3 questions really, really clearly. Tokyo to that still, but particularly at that point, had some really sort of bad work cultural issues in terms of the way people were working, the types of environment that they were working in. And so to create this sort of new, much more flexible, much more amenity-rich environment for Googlers, that they actually brought all of their enterprise customers through. So lots of different companies within Japan were coming to see how you could work. So it made a big difference to people's experience at work.
It's funny you should say that. Our Japan business is really focusing on that too. So there's a bunch of Japanese capital owners and investors that have a bunch of buildings that need to be refurbed and are brought up to sustainability standards. And one of the number one things that they have been talking to us about when they come to visit us is workplace.
Yeah.
It's time now for Japanese businesses to start to think more about this, and we want to be at the edge. And we've got this 1980s, 1990s building that needs to be refurbished. We don't just want to knock it down because it's embedded carbon in it, so we've got to think a bit smarter about this.
Yeah.
What do you guys do? Right?
And we are looking at one of those projects for you. And
yes, of course you are. Yes.
Yokohama.
Yeah.
And it is. It's about
I
creating.
think you guys
an
are there next week or
environment.
something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not me.
Not you.
No.
Oh, well.
Still difficult to get in and out.
Well, you become the boss. What happens?
That's right.
And let you out of the
I've
office.
been a few too many times. No, that's not true. I'd love to go back. But it is about creating workplace that inspires creativity and innovation, which, so it is a lot about learnings from Australia going into Tokyo.
And I think the key with our Japanese investors and partners and friends is that they love Australia. They love Australia not just because of our beautiful country. I think they really find an affinity with people here, and that there is just this deep willingness to and friendship between between us. You saw it a bit between our political leaders. You've seen it now with the outpouring of support for after the murder of Shinzo Abe in this country, right?
Yeah.
And I just think that has allowed us as countries to sort of become closer and closer investors. And I think we have been very fortunate at Lend-Lease to have a very successful Japanese business that has allowed more and more capital to understand what we do here. And we've some of the most recent projects have all had Japanese backing and Japanese capital. So I think it's an interesting segue from your stories in Tokyo, because we've got quite a few of them as well. I think
it's definitely a market that's just waiting to be really sort of blown apart in terms of how they do things.
And it's interesting, the Consul General Kia, who's just about to return home, one of his comments was, we see a lot of Japanese capital coming to Australia. We haven't seen enough Japanese business operating here.
Yeah.
And my response back to him is the same goes the other way. It's actually very difficult to start a functioning business in Japan.
Yeah.
We were lucky in the sense that we bought a company. It was well before my time at Lend-Lease, but we bought a company that was there already, and we have a principal there, and Andrew Gauci, who is steeped in the culture, speaks the language fluently. I argue better than he speaks English, which he finds offensive, but that's okay. And that's what's allowed us to succeed. Having a real local focus in how we do business there, which is pretty exciting. I'll just go back to my notes, which I put down, and we've kind of strayed from what I was going to ask you.
A lot.
But having said that, I don't think we have. If I look what I was going to ask you, let's go back to Western Sydney. So, that's us creating a new city. It's a greenfield city. There's very, very few examples, I would say, in developed markets of that happening. You have an airport core. You've got the North-South rail line that's a PPP that's gone in there. You've got the West Metro that's going to go towards that area. So that's the spine, which is great. We've got a lot of housing development happening out there, which is good. It shouldn't really be called out there, really. It's not that far from where we are now. What have we got to do to get it right? We talked a little bit about it. Let's return to it.
I think the key now is actually the secondary transport connections. And I'm talking about the airport itself. I think the Aerotropolis and Bradfield is probably a whole nother conversation. And I wonder whether there needs to be more sort of focus on existing areas to start with. The train connection from the airport for 10 or 20 years until it is extended is not great for a lot of people that live in Western Sydney, and so ensuring that rapid bus connections for the workforce at the airport are put in place, and so that's from Liverpool, 15th Avenue towards, and then also from Campbelltown. So making sure that actually the people who have those wonderful jobs that the airport creates are able to easily and sustainably get to the airport, because at the moment not a lot of that is actually set in stone.
Because how many people will actually work at the airport?
Oh, Lots.
Be thousands, right?
Thousands.
Yeah, it'd be
I
thousands.
don't know the number though.
So I can't remember the patronage of the airport. I think it's up to 10,000.
And
flights.
that's sort of the terminal part of the airport, but the cargo part
Cargo,
and what that
there's
facilitates.
an industrial
and
precinct.
Yeah, it's huge.
So there'll be thousands of people.
Thousands of thousands.
Even if they're not
who's-
flying anywhere, even
Exactly.
if they're not working on aviation at all.
Yeah.
Right. So
And I think that is so focusing on the workers and their connectivity, not just the passengers and travellers and their connectivity, I think is really key to making the airport work. And then I still have conversations with people about, oh, why have we got this new airport? It takes ages for me to get there from Bondi, and it's like, well,
not for
hey,
you,
because it's
my
not
friends.
for you.
It's not for you, my friend.
And it's not for anyone in Parramatta
No,
either,
it's
because I
not.
think that's everyone's. But it's miles from Parramatta. It's like, yeah, it's not for them either. So just really kind of, I think educating the public and the broader New South Wales of what is this airport for, what is it doing, I think still does need a little bit of work.
Well, 2 out of 3 new citizens, 2 out of 3 new migrants into Sydney in New South Wales are going to be living in Western Sydney.
Yeah.
Right?
Western Parkland.
Western Parkland City, as in west of Parramatta.
Yeah.
So, yes, our friend from Bondi, as much as we love you,
You've
you've got an airport. It's not for you.
And sorry, you can't fly out after 11 o'clock.
Yes, yeah. So, Kingsford Smith is your airport, right?
Yeah.
And so, in a way, this infrastructure is built for people that aren't even here yet.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. No, completely.
So it's our opportunity to sort of get it right. And one of the things I keep banging on about, to use the term, is sequencing of social infrastructure, or the webbing in the Western Parkland City. It's not just about the planning of it. That's fine, but the capital for it is key. And public sector balance sheets are under strain at federal level, at state level. State balance sheets all over the country are under strain. And so you have no choice now but to work more collaboratively with the private sector to sequence social infrastructure. And that means new ways of thinking about how to finance.
To sequence social infrastructure, but I also think that there needs to be some sort of pulling together so that there is some market competitiveness around certain areas. Sure. It feels a lot at the moment that there's not many tenants to go around a whole lot of potential development opportunities, and so actually maybe just sort of pulling it in a little bit and saying, right, this is where we're going to focus.
You mean back to the nodes concept?
Yeah,
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if you don't start with density somewhere, you end up with sprawl.
Exactly.
That's always been the issue, right?
Yeah.
If you look at any of our cities where the green belt has kind of been taken up, one of the benefits of this city is the water. The water has allowed us to densify. Right?
Yes.
So we haven't spread out as much as we need to.
And that goes for residential, obviously, but I think it also goes for just all of those amazing sort of businesses that we're attracting from overseas. They have got lots of different options of where they might go at the moment, which doesn't really put competitiveness into the market in terms of who will develop and who will spend money out there.
I agree with that, but I also agree that if we're going to have 2 out of 3 new people living in Western Sydney, and they're going to be living in housing stock that is great for families and whatever, and we do all that as well, you can't have a situation where it's immediately you're in your car and you've got to drive to get to the eastern city. Right? It's what Lucy Turnbull talks a lot about in the 30-minute city concept, which means that you then need to have the right nodes in the right places with the right type of industrial base to do that. And Prime Minister Rudd, when he was elected, talked about the double drop-off concept. I mean, he was Prime Minister, 15 years ago or something now? 2007 he was elected, right? We still haven't solved that problem, right, as a concept.
What's the double drop-off?
A double drop-off is you have 2 children in different schools.
Right,
so one's in preschool and the other one's in high school or whatever, and you've got to drop them off, right? Yeah. And until we have robots or flying cars or whatever, that's not going to happen, right?
So it is, and this flashes me back to New York, where 9-year-olds jump on the subway and get themselves to school in the morning, and and I tell you that story because it just shows you how far we are from an actually dense city, even in Sydney Eastern CBD. We're a very, very long way.
This is a great debate around, are we, and we'll do a whole nother podcast on this issue, which is, are we educating our young people with the right life skills to kind of function in a big city, right? So in Japan, 9-year-olds, in Hong Kong, 9-year-olds will get on the train and go to school themselves. I know for a fact that my kids aren't at that point yet.
No.
You know, and I mean, you know, our kids can walk to their school, but
they're not very good at crossing roads, though.
They're exactly right.
Yeah.
So they're not. And to be fair, I'm not sure that the middle child is ready yet. But you know, perhaps we're getting. You know, there's that Japanese game show that shows a 3 or 4-year-old is given a task to go to a supermarket and buy stuff, and I haven't seen it. My brother was telling me about it, and the child did it, went there, bought all the stuff for dinner, forgot one thing, went back, and bought it, and came back to their flat, and I thought, my goodness, there's no way in hell my 3-year-old is doing anything like that.
No.
We'll have to end soon. It's been a wonderful conversation, as always, and we can go many, many more directions. But where we're sitting now, so we're in a period of time in the world where cities are changing. There's a lot of challenges that we've discussed. If I was to ask you 3 things that we should do in Australia to be ahead of the curve from an architect and design and business perspective, what would they be?
Need to get the right demand. So I think getting the right talent into Australia to be making the most of science and technology parks, making the most of new hospitals, like really take this opportunity and getting our universities back on track in terms of international students, like really getting the demand back through immigration, I think is really important. The other point I think I've made often, just focus on where we've invested the infrastructure and really make sure that we're sweating those assets, that the government spent all of that money on train lines to there, airports to there, really make sure that we're getting the most out of those spaces before we start to kind of look at other areas. And then I think sustainability is the other one. And Australia in general, I think it would be great for us to have a sustainable brand like New Zealand does. I'm not sure that we do as much as we could. But then also when I look at Western Sydney, in terms of livability and attracting people to live there and heat, and just making sure that we've got, you know, the right water, the right flood mitigation strategies, the right amount of tree canopy for the people who live in Western Sydney. We really have to get serious about sustainable
development. We have so much more work to do on that last point, and you should come back and we'll have more of a conversation on that.
Yeah.
I think as an industry, that to me is one of, and it's not just in Western Sydney, in other sort of growing Australian cities. You know,
as an industry and government, I think we could live with a little more regulation.
I agree. I mean, I find the tree canopy issue in Western Sydney really concerning when you've got these large housing developments that don't have trees, and you're just like, well, this is Australia.
And it's incredible the power that it can have. Like Singapore's 50% greening strategy. That is brand Singapore.
100%.
That is what Singapore stands for now.
No one's saying that the Singapore, a land of buildings, is not a green city, right? So there's no argument to say that this can't be done. I mean, I thoroughly support the City of Sydney's greening Sydney policy here. And we're fortunate. We've got good tree canopy here, and they want to improve it. Why is it in Sydney's West we haven't prioritised this? I find it extraordinary. And everyone you talk to in executive levels of a civil service or an industry agrees on this point. So if we're all agreed, why haven't we done it?
We've done it,
yeah. It's.
I think it's city council level. I think it's LEPs.
Well, yeah. I don't know. But surely we can do better.
Yeah, agreed.
Right. Well, we'll come back and we'll talk more on that point, because I think there's a lot more we can do. But for now, Sarah Kay, thank you so much for being part of Smarter Cities.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great fun.